Thank you. Rick.
So IBM is here in Israel. There's a lot of newcomers to the high-tech industry in Israel. IBM's not one of them. We're here since 1949 when we opened our first office here. Our research lab in Haifa opened in 1972 with 3 or 4 scientists. It's grown to several hundred since then. In the last decade, we've acquired 13 companies here in Israel, most recently Trusteer last August in the security and cyberspace. We've, of late, following our friends at Deutsche Telekom, we've opened up a deep cyber research lab in partnership with Ben Gurion University. It opened in the last month. We're starting with 30 researchers and expect that to grow substantially. So, and then last but not least, we opened up an accelerator at our headquarters in Tel Aviv, and we have our first 8 startup companies resident with us in our offices today. So IBM has deep roots in the country. We're well invested and continue to invest. The reason, they've talked about talent, but I want to add another element. Of course, it's talent, it's people. There's massive competition within a company like IBM for where research is going to go, where acquisitions are going to be consummated. Fierce competition within the company, and yet Israel wins out time after time. We have that research lab in Haifa is the second biggest in the world after the United States. And our acquisition pace is aggressive. But the other element I would add is productivity. There's a lot of talk about the average productivity of Israeli workers, and is it adequate or not? I can tell you in the high-tech industry, the productivity of Israeli workers is extremely high. And so when we look at the equation around compensation and productivity, it's actually relatively inexpensive for us to work in Israel because of that, even though salaries are rather competitive with the rest of the world, the productivity levels are extremely high here.
Thank you. It's interesting that nobody is mentioning the weather, the beach, the fun in Tel Aviv. Anyhow, as you see, we are talking about huge companies. Each one of them is the size of a medium GDP of a country. And I will stay with you, Rick, and I will ask you a bit tough question. You know, there is a shortage of engineers in Israel. Now, if you take an engineer that is working in the multinational company, and his added value is what is just his salary, which is high, as we know, higher than compared to if he would work in an Israeli company. But if this is in shortage, the alternative is to take this engineer that will work in an Israeli company with much more added value, much more taxes, the revenue itself, the profit. So how do you refer to that?
So, you know, first off, when I think of IBM Israel, and it's the way that IBM has always thought about its relationship with the countries we do business in, I think of IBM Israel as an Israeli company at its core. I would test. I can only say this is on a relatively limited scale, but I will tell you that the salaries paid, and I can't talk about multinationals in general, but I can certainly talk about IBM, are competitive in the market. We lose good people to Israeli companies, so the presumption that Israeli companies are paying less money, I think you really need to test. This is, you know, when you think of the Israeli labor market, and I constantly tell my colleagues at IBM Global, when they're thinking about how to manage this environment, and I'm 2.5 years into this, so I've learned a lot in that time. This is Silicon Valley Part 2. It's extremely competitive. When you think of these growing startup companies they pay very competitively versus multinationals. It's not like you go to a startup and make a lot less money, not my experience, not in the niches that we play in cyber and storage and areas like that, red hot markets in Israel. They're very competitive in the marketplace with Israeli companies. And I don't draw a distinction between whether a really good engineer works at IBM or at any of the companies of my peers here, or another Israeli company, and I mean that, another Israeli company, because that's how we think of ourselves. We are part of this ecosystem, we're part of the country, and we don't think of ourselves any differently than, maybe if you think of any other of the big global tech companies, whether they're Checkpoint or Amdocs or others that are Israeli companies at their core, are they really that very different than any other multinational that is situated here?
I would like to stay with this, let's call it the challenges that we see from of course, we see in Israel the multinational companies' activity as a positive thing. I mean, when I was in the Ministry of Finance, all my presentation, I saw this huge numbers of research and development centers of this company as really a blessing. But Arik, I will ask you with two more things that maybe it's we can see a problem in this activity. One is the effect on the salary. I mean, if there is a shortage and the willingness to pay of the multinationals are much more than the Israelis, so you see that the salary is going up. And from the perspective of Israeli startup, it's a burden. And the other thing is the fact that the multinational companies is watching all the time about new startups, Israeli startups, and they buy it before it's growing up to have much more effect on the economy.
So, first of all, I wish you were right. Because if that was the case, I would have been able to give offers to people and grab them even faster. But that's not the case. You probably know that Qualcomm has by now completed 5 acquisitions in Israel in the past, I would say, 3-4 years, out of which 4 were startups. Now, obviously, when we integrate the people and go over their, salaries and everything, it's amazing to see, just as Rick just said, the salaries are at par. Okay? I see the salaries, then we rate them, obviously, and give, and it's pretty often that they continue with almost the same salary, just to let you know.
At the end of the day, it's supply and demand. The labor market is a market like any other market.
Yes, so I see your point, but it's not that we're setting the bar very high and therefore startups cannot exist. Secondly, with regards to acquisition, so first of all, a startup that doesn't want, desire, or aspire to be acquired is not acquired, right? And you have examples here in Israel of startups that grew and continued and then made it to production and medium size and large size, right? You have Checkpoint, you have Mellanox, and a few other examples. So it's not always that it's something that a multinational will force founders or investors, definitely not investors, right, to do something that is not good to them. So at the end of the day, I think that multinational actually serve here some of the, a large part of the industry of people that are very good at innovating, bringing true solutions to real problems, and then when they reach the point where they want to, to make this available to the entire, to a large population, and they feel that they don't have the leverage to do that, then this is when they come to us, okay? Imagine a startup company of 50, 60 people comes to Qualcomm with the technology that is good, that no one opens the door to them, because people like Samsung, like Apple, will not open the door for a company of 60, 70 people and take and launch a product like iPhone 7 or 8 with such. So we actually are enabler for those companies to allow them to make the difference. So a startup company that comes to Qualcomm and has the ability to launch their product, think of the engineer that started 7, 8 years ago, and now his product goes and multiplies itself to something around 800 or even 1 billion chipsets a year. Think how that feels to this inventor.
Meir, I see that you want to argue.
Yeah, no, I want to widen the discussion a little bit. First, let's start with the premise of your question. We in Israel talk a lot about the importance of competition. I don't know why we should be defensive if finally we have competition in a certain industry. Consumers are fighting for more competition of companies, so the cost of living will go down. We want to bring as much competition so the quality of our products and productivity will go up. So finally, we should be very proud that there is a lot of competition in the technology sector. And I wish and hope for our engineers today and those who will come that there will always be competition for them. That's a great thing. I think that if you will ask the computer scientists here, they'll want a lot of competition for them. And if we have supply problems, as you just mentioned, because there is more demand than supply today on computer scientists, we need to solve it on the supply side by pushing more education agenda, making sure our students study mathematics and sciences.
Like in the real estate, right? The increase of the price of the housing, you have to increase supply, not to.
I agree.
Not to work on
I agree, but I agree. So on that's the competition. But then I want to also add a wider dimension, because we're kind of comparing startups to multinationals in a frozen way, where really the way I look at it, as I said, is an ecosystem, that there is constant flow in this ecosystem, and that's what makes the ecosystem so special and strong and attractive for everyone. So this flow means that, companies can acquire startups and bring entrepreneurial talent into them and allow those startups, like we just heard, to have a real impact globally. It also means that people that work in multinationals and are exposed to how multinationals think, what they want, are exposed to international standards, leave at a certain point and join a startup and bring those skills and this specific knowledge into those startups, which increases the success of those startups. So I think that when you look at it that way, it's actually a flow of stuff that increases the value of the whole pie. And if I can give just one example of that through an acquisition, because we talked about the negative stuff of acquisition, look at the acquisition, for example, of Waze in Israel. So the company was acquired. People say for a very, very high value, but I'm not going to give my interpretation on that. But look at the other parts of this. The company stayed in Israel, so because we have actually a significant R&D in Israel, it was easier for Google to make also the decision for them to stay here. So we keep the people here. We grew 50%, Yarom, the number of people that work in Waze now. So the number of employees actually grew. You talked about taxes. Google paid 800 million NIS shekels in taxes for the acquisition of Waze, which was second only to the Ishkar acquisition by Warren Buffett in Israel. So you look at the different aspects of this, and now those folks working on mapping and all that, which is core to Google, and how that can grow here, et cetera, et cetera. So I think overall, it's very, very good for the ecosystem.
Guy, I see that you want to add, but I will, look, my role here is to attack you, so I just want to add to that. Don't you think that actually Israel is selling the excellent brands that we have here to the multinational very cheap? And actually it's a transfer of knowledge that otherwise the alternative could be much higher growth for the Israeli economy.
So I invite all of us to imagine Israel without the multinationals, okay? So first you're saying selling cheap, and then you're complaining that we're paying high salaries. I don't get that. But seriously, we are so proud of the percentage or ratio of patents pro capita in Israel, right? That number, I think, I don't have the statistics, but we're definitely number one in the world in number of patents per person. If you take away the number of patents that were initiated or actually registered by multinationals in Israel, we drop to number 30 in the world or something like that. We're just not there. You talk about the, the rate of innovation, of R&D, as a contributor to GDP, right? We're all very proud of where we are on those indexes. And if you take away the impact of the multinationals, we drop to a middle place. We're not bad, right? But overall, the contribution of multinationals here in Israel, and I think Meir correctly pointed out, that's the ecosystem. We take away the multinationals, who's going to buy those companies? Where are the exits going to come from? And then why would investors come here to invest in companies? Take that away, it's not existent. Now, the notion that a patent that happened to be registered by a foreign company, a multinational company, is not an Israeli patent is preposterous to me. Because there's this spillover that you alluded to, right? That person who developed, or those people who developed that new technology, would then go on to develop additional stuff, right? We're developing the pool of knowledge, we're allowing people at the expense of the rich foreigners to come up with new stuff that then will be used for new startups, for new ideas, for additional money into the industry. So selling cheap, no, we're actually very expensive in that respect. The multinationals come in, they invest a lot of money. I'm pretty sure that between all of us, we've invested more into Israel than any other country together as the companies. And I'm not sure that the government or the public or the journalists or the ecosystem really appreciates the contribution of multinationals to the Israeli economy. So I'd like to challenge you back and say, potentially we should have more incentives and think longer term from the small stuff, how we treat experts that come from a different country, visas, right? People come in on a tourist visa as an expert, we probably prevent them from entering Israel. When they want to leave Israel, we pry into their private stuff for hours and they miss their flights and never want to come back. And that's the small stuff. You go all the way to government incentives. We're just making it much harder to our companies to keep doing what we're doing.
Gil, what is the real commitment of a multinational like you to stay in Israel? I mean, imagine there is either a geopolitical problem, and what is the effect of the geopolitical problem, specifically the last operations that we had this summer, and or a problem in GM. I mean, a recovery plan or turnaround plan that from one day to another, the decision will be, okay, stop the activity in Israel.